Marisa LaFleur, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm very pleased to introduce Sylvie Tissot, discussing her book, Good Neighbors, Gentrifying Diversity in Boston's South End, in conversation with Boston historian Jim Vrabel. Jim Vrabel is an author, longtime community activist, Boston historian, and former newspaper reporter and municipal official. Sylvie Tissot is a professor of political science at the University of Vincennes Saint-Denis in Paris, as well as a sociologist and activist.
This is a book about gentrification, and even if there are already a lot of books on gentrification, I try to develop my own argument or my own perspective on this process of gentrification. And often it is seen as the result of the developers' interest for new spaces in order to generate profit. And in an era of neoliberalism, urban policies also play a crucial role, as not only do they not consider gentrification and displacement of the poor as a problem, but often as a solution to renovate poor neighborhoods. Well, taking into account political and economic factors, I decided to focus on the role of gentrifiers and the way they appropriated a neighborhood. And by appropriation, I mean how they take ownership, literally and symbolically. And how was this appropriation possible? How come other groups could not maintain their hold despite intense protests in the 60s and the 70s that are very well documented in Jim's book? While in the book, I try to solve this enigma, going back to the movement against urban renewal, how the promotion of participatory planning instead of bulldozers helped the emergence of a local elite and did not realize all the demands of low-income residents. Well, this elite, as I call it, is far from homogeneous, but it has succeeded not only to use resources to move into this neighborhood, the South End, but also to impose a lifestyle based on consumption and philanthropy, a narrative of the South End, a three-period narrative: the glory of the past, of the Victorian architecture, the decline, and the reconquest. It has also succeeded in marking public space through the erasure of almost all of what had existed before. This is a book about Boston, about its long and contradictory history of conservatism and liberalism, of racial segregation and praise of diversity. Why choose Boston? I didn't really choose Boston, actually, but I'm glad I ended up studying the South End, because looking at all these contradictions helped me develop a broader argument, which is not only about gentrification, but also about class structure. And Boston provided a great site of observation of the emergence of a new cause, the cause of diversity. I studied mobilization, although mobilization that are very different from the mobilization studied by Jim in his book. That's why I think our books are very, very complementary. Well, going back to diversity, all of my interviewees explained to me that they moved to the South End not only because of its beautiful architecture, but also because it is diverse along race, class, age, sexual orientation lines. Unlike a lot of people in America who still support, I guess, segregation, they clearly enjoy diversity. But they also have strict limits on what constitutes a reasonable proportion of others in the population, and object to a presence, especially in public spaces, that would contravene upper middle class social norms. Well, this is a troubling ambivalence that I try to describe and analyze in the book. The cause of diversity does not rest on logics on exclusion, or rather exclusion goes hand in hand with forms of inclusion And it signals, this is my argument, changes in the nature of social boundaries. Well, of course, white homeowners are very, very anxious to control diversity, and sometimes fight against the population or the group that might threaten property interests. But embracing diversity also means transforming the new resident sphere into a pride in adventure and altruistic engagement. And some of the leaders I met seek to educate newcomers to teach them certain rules of cohabitation and tolerance, but based on the assumption that diversity is good for everyone. Yet, is this diversity good for everyone? Does everyone enjoy and praise this diversity? And has everyone the same definition of diversity? That's one of the topics of the book that I hope will create debate. Thank you.
I have written a somewhat different book than Sylvie. The People's History of the New Boston tries to tell stories of every neighborhood and of campaigns for civil rights and school reform, welfare reform, tenant, homeowner, and consumer rights, the fights against urban renewal, against highway construction, against expansion at Logan Airport, and the conflicts over Vietnam and busing that were so much a part of the 1960s and 1970s. The purpose of the book is to kind of dispel the myth that the new Boston was built by a few city fathers, all of them men, all of them white, most of them well off, sitting in the boardrooms downtown or at City Hall. In fact, I think the new Boston was built by a lot of people in the neighborhoods, many of them women, many of them people of color, many of them poor and not well off. So I tried to set the record straight in that regard. One of the things that did happen along the way, though, was that maybe all those people did too good a job, and that the Boston of today is too good to be true, or too good to be available to all the people that maybe would like to and should live in it. At the end of the book, I have a chapter on Boston today, and I talk about cities, especially American cities, and that they are supposed to be ladders of opportunity, that people can climb up to better lives. The old Boston, I say, was broken, the Boston of the 1930s and 40s and 50s. The old Boston was broken because the rings of the ladder in the middle and on the top were missing. The middle class had left, the well-off had left. The new Boston was built to put those rings back in the ladder. But today, the ladder of Boston is broken because the rungs of the ladder just up from the bottom, the working class and the lower middle class, are missing, and Boston has become a city of the poor and the well-off. No place illustrates that probably better than the South End, which is what Sylvie's book is all about. I guess, trying to think where to start. This is mostly going to be a discussion between Sylvie and me, and then between you and us, I believe. And I guess I would like to start by posing to Sylvie and have her answer the question that the gentrifiers that came to Boston in the 60s, especially the urban pioneers, played a very positive role and had a lot of good reasons to come to Boston. I'll say this and have Sylvie react to it, but I'd like to quote Chris Hayes, a longtime South End resident, who said, for one thing, these new people gave people who had grown up here a chance to sell their houses and move out to the suburbs themselves. For another, most of the first wave of newcomers worked hard. They joined neighborhood organizations and sent their kids to the neighborhood schools. So So I just, I guess my first question, my first thought to throw out is, weren't especially the first wave of the newcomers in the South End and in Boston and throughout Boston positive for those neighborhoods and for the city? Sylvie, would you like to react?
Well, it's a difficult question, and my first reaction is to say, you know, I'm a sociologist, so it's not my job to say if it's positive or negative. So I try to distance from this kind of moral judgments, but I don't want to avoid any discussion about that subject. And well, in my book, I explained that there aren't, you know, one group of urban pioneers, and challenging the usual narrative of gentrification with the first wave of gentrifiers who are very very tolerant, often artists, middle-class people with very liberal or even radical ideas. And I think it was much more heterogeneous than that. And this narrative of three waves of gentrifiers that you will find in some books about gentrification, I think in some ways is too simplistic. And among the first gentrifiers who moved to the South End, you could find some people, upper middle class, or I could say even upper class people, who joined the historical society and who had very different, you know, values or ideas or principles. That some people who fought with, you know, black people or Latino people for against urban renewal and decent housing conditions. So I'm not sure there is such a thing as urban pioneers. They were very, very different people, from very radical ones to very conservative ones, including people who joined the historical society, or rather ran, I mean, the historical society, including some real estate agents. And I try to describe and analyze the role of these different groups and how they even fought against each other.
Mm-hmm. All right, now you brought up these historical societies, so I'm going to weigh in here. You're not the first French sociologist that came to Boston. In 1832, Alexis de Tocqueville came to Boston, and he said of the people in Boston, their manners are distinguished, and conversation turns to intellectual matters. One feels oneself delivered from those commercial habits that render society in New York so vulgar. Those are the kind of French sociologists that we like to see. But you're not, you are welcome as well. We welcome all kinds. I have two questions now. One is, isn't it a fact that every neighborhood, as it changes, the new people who become the kind of dominant force takes over a neighborhood in different ways? In the 1870s, when the South End started off as an upper middle class neighborhood, all of a sudden it changed with the Panic of 1873 and the building of the Back Bay, and it was taken over by lower class immigrants. They had their own ways of staking out the territory, of taking control. Isn't this more, as much anthropology as sociology, and that the people that you talk about in your book, the upper middle class gentrifiers, whether there's a moral value, a positive or negative moral value, they're just doing what any group does. They become the dominant group in an area, and they stake out their territory in different ways. Poor people stake out their ways differently than rich people. Middle class people stake out their different ways than working class people. Isn't that a natural phenomenon as neighborhoods change?
Well, as a sociologist, I would say there are no such thing as natural forces. Everything is a social construction and a historical construction. So there are no rules that would say that some people go to a space and have to take over this space. I mean, there's no such rules. Some scholars, including Pierre Bourdieu, because you mentioned Tocqueville, but Bourdieu is another sociologist that whose work inspired me probably much more than Tocqueville, has a theory about distinction, about social distinction, focusing especially on the upper class, what we call in French classe supérieure. And he had this theory that class identity rests on a lifestyle, relationships to culture, in particular high culture, and that's something I use in my chapter on the historical society. And through this lifestyle and this culture, I mean, it's a way of distinguishing oneself from other groups. So it's a relational approach to class structure, which has an exclusionary dimension. And I use this theory to analyze what's happened in the historical society and how we could analyze a shared taste for Victorian architecture, which can seem neutral. You know, why not trying to rediscover this history? Why not trying to rediscover this amazing and beautiful Victorian architecture? Yet, what was done, you know, through these cultural activities was much more crucial in terms of actually process of gentrification. It has a crucial economic issue because, of course, rediscovering Victorian architecture allowed to add a cachet, and real estate agents were very eager, of course, to encourage newcomers and people living in the suburbs to look at the South End not as a skid row, as a ghetto, but as a historic district. That's one issue. The other issue was not only economic, but political. And there were a lot of fights, a lot of campaigns that were led in the name of history, in the name of preservation, against other groups, namely Black and Latino groups, who were demanding more decent housing conditions. And these demands, the historical society was very opposed to. And the third dimension of these cultural activities in the historical society is, I would say, symbolic. But the symbolic is crucial as well. The historical society imposed a narrative, this narrative I was talking about, this three-period narrative, suggesting that the decline of the South End came with all these immigrants who moved into the South End, and not only making them invisible in the history of the South End, but making the newcomers and their efforts to renovate the brownstones the only legitimate residents in the South End. Sorry, it was a long answer to your question. Maybe
That's fine. Well, my next question, and again, since we're in a bookstore, I'm going to pull out a literary allusion to Henry James and note the irony of Henry James in his 1877 novel, The American. The protagonist, Christopher Newman, goes to Paris and naively is schooled by the Parisians in the ins and outs, power plays, and etiquette of the class struggle, and leaves badly damaged at the experience. I'm wondering if it's somewhat naive to think that could people who move into a neighborhood be well-meaning, be idealistic in their approach to wanting to live in a diverse neighborhood, but be somewhat naive about how difficult that really is to do, and so that in a day-to-day existence find themselves straying from maybe the intent they had, but maybe because they didn't realize how hard it is to do it.
Well, I think once again it's not about judging how people, meant wealth. That there's no doubt about that for a lot of them, for maybe most of them, for maybe most of us. I mean, we always mean well. I guess, to me, the way social science can be useful is not to say, you know, human wealth, and in reality, you had all this, you know, private interest and all this naivety. It's not about that. It's to go beyond intentions and to see what kind of power relations are at stake. So, you know, of course, and also I think one reason why intentions can contradict, why there can be a contradiction between practices and intention is because we are also socially conditioned. And moving into a neighborhood as a white person, white middle-class person in the 60s and the 70s is something that is, of course, a very intense experience, of course.
Well,
so it means crossing boundaries. It means crossing spatial boundaries, racial boundaries, social boundaries, economic boundaries, and that's far from being easy. So there were many, many ways of dealing with this fear, of dealing with these problems that resulted from crossing boundaries. And what resulted from that, I argue in the book, is this very ambivalent praise of diversity, this very ambivalent watchword of diversity, which both means we like diversity, we embrace it, still we want to control it.
Well, again, to follow up, could it be we embrace diversity, we embrace diversity, but diversity is very difficult to attain. You say in the book that spatial proximity is one thing, but social nearness is another. And is it maybe that we all have to figure out and try harder to figure out ways to actually enact that diversity, that the government, that the private sector, that the residents themselves have to seek out ways? I had a kind of a casual note to myself, shouldn't the upper class just loosen up a little and the lower class maybe quiet down a little, and maybe we could figure out that going to Little League games or festivals or historical society meetings or things that you aren't comfortable with, that it takes work, but you have to go out of your comfort zone, that the city itself has to weigh in on things like inclusionary zoning and limited equity co-ops and things like that, that it really is difficult. As much as people can find fault with gentrification and gentrifiers, there is an idealism there, and that maybe we haven't realized how hard that work is and how much assistance is needed from other institutions in society to really enact it on a day-to-day basis. What do you think?
I think I agree, although I would say there are two issues. There is the issue of diversity and living together and cohabitation and living in the same neighborhood and mixing, and that's one thing, which of course should be a goal, versus segregation, of course. And there's something else which is socioeconomic inequalities and discrimination. People can live together in a building, in a neighborhood, even in the same house, In France in 18th century, the servants lived in the same, hôtel particulier where the aristocrats lived, and there were a lot of, proximity. So I think it's two different things, and maybe we should think of what kind of goal do we have? Is it about, living together but not addressing the question of socioeconomic inequalities and discrimination? We can do that, and in a lot of gentrified neighborhoods or gentrifying neighborhoods, that's the case. In fact, it's diverse in the sense that you have different groups of people, but still you have a lot of contrast, a lot of inequalities, And it's not because people live in the same neighborhood that these inequalities will be reduced or will disappear. So I think we have to distinguish the two processes.
I'd agree. I don't know if you, but I would say that it's a good start to live together. That sure, there's more work to be done, but I think people should get credit for trying and living together. I don't know if you've heard of this controversy about the poor door in New York City. There's a high-rise building recently that was built. The well-off people can go in the front, and they have membership in the health club and all kinds of privileges. And there are 55 units in the building. Those people have to go in the back door. I think a lot of people think that that's scandalous. I myself don't think it is as scandalous as many people. And for the 55 units, there were 90,000 applications. The idea of being not very well off and living in Midtown Manhattan, I guess made people think, let those other people go in that door. At least I live in Midtown Manhattan and I can walk to work. So again, I would say that there is a benefit, and it's whether it's the first step of 2 steps or the first step of many steps, it is a benefit. I want to turn it over for questions, but there's one other. I guess my last question would be: you talk about gentrification as an ineluctable phenomenon. Nothing can stop it, you say.
Are you sure?
Said it, you said it.
Which page?
Which page? 4. Regrettable but ineluctable phenomenon. I wonder if there are ways to not stop it, but channel it, make it fulfill its promise. And I mentioned some with inclusionary zoning and linkage and limited deeds and deed exclusions and things like that. Are there ways to harness this gentrification that we are finding in cities all across the world and neighborhoods all across the city? Are there ways to channel it?
Yeah, of course. There are urban policies that are more or less, or in some ways, allowed to channel it, like supporting public housing. I mean, that seems obvious, but supporting public housing allow low-income people to live in these neighborhoods. That's one. I mean, it's so easy, isn't it? And the last thing I will say on that subject is go to Marseille. It's a beautiful city, and gentrification didn't, it didn't work. Public authorities tried to, start gentrification and accelerate gentrification with a lot of private investment, even American private investment, and it didn't work. Isn't that fascinating?
The last thing I just want to say about, I forgot to address this earlier on, about the power relationships. In writing my book, I talked to Mel King a lot, and he was very insistent that the power relationships that the people, poor and working class people, did exert a lot of power in the urban renewal process and since, and that if they hadn't, and if they hadn't organized so well, you wouldn't have the affordable housing that there is in the South End. That they actually had the upper hand in the power relationships for 10 or 20 years before it kind of shifted. One of the problems about organizing, one of the things that was easier organizing back then was you had the government to fight. And they were an easy target and pretty stationary. Now you're trying to fight the economy, and the economy is a much more difficult target. So would you concede that for a while at least the poor, working class, many of the minorities were able to exert their power and to carve out a place in the South End that they wouldn't have had otherwise.
Yes, sure. Yeah.
Oh, good, I got one.
I mean, it's very clear in your book.
Oh, okay. Hear that?
So-
It's very clear in my book.
You know, getting back on the poor door, the acceptance of that as any measure is something for the population to have the good fortune to live in Midtown seems like such a, I don't know, bizarre acceptance of the situation we, as someone who lives in one of the BRA units in the South End, that are there for artists as opposed to, I think.
Real people.
Well, no, as opposed to poor people, which is what the mandate is, right? Those units are the artists that can use them because of fumes and other impact on their neighbors. They can't populate those units. So it's sort of a bit of a petting zoo of artists as opposed to functioning. It just seems like a very bizarre measure of acceptance, that poor door thing that you said.
I've lived in the South End for 50 years, and I don't recognize the South End that you write about, Ms. Tissot. And there are numbers of errors in your book, some of which are clearly attributable to its being a translation. And I'm hoping that you come to the South End because we have a lot to talk about. But when I say I don't recognize the South End, it's because I don't see us and haven't seen us divided into the kind of rigid classes of upper class and lower class and working class, etc., that you posit. I was a member of CPAC, and we worked very hard to create precisely the kind of low-income housing which is now limited, but there. You talk about how the South End minority population is decreasing, but in fact, CPAC and others arranged to have the O'Day block, which you don't mention. You mentioned 1968 as being a pivotal year in the South End. It was the year after Tom Atkins was elected, the first African American elected to the city council at large, and he was chair of the housing committee, and he created CPAC, and CPAC reflected that. There's not a mention of Tom Atkins in your book. The Ward 4 Democratic Committee, which had supported him, was created and helped kill the South End bypass. There are children in the South End, and children are the glue of the South End. You don't have a single family with children growing up there which worked to create schools there. And so I'm hoping you come to the South End and we can talk in greater detail about these things.
Well, thanks for this invitation. I look forward to it. And I regularly go to the South End, so that won't be difficult to organize. But what I can say is that I'm afraid that there are so many people in the South End that you won't find all of them in my book. I'm sorry about that. And I don't deny that a lot of public housing were built in the South End. You know, I don't say that in my book.
I noticed also the few number of children in the book, and I was struck by that, and I was puzzled by that, and I was trying to figure out why there was the Hurley School at the end, and busing situation was mentioned, but the actual children were not present. And then it occurred to me, and tell me if I'm theorizing incorrectly, you spoke to a lot of neighborhood associations and groups, and it has come to sort of my awareness that a significant number of those organizations are run by childless people. And it's just something I only noticed recently, and partially because of reading your book. And I thought, did that influence you? Or was it timing? I know that in the last 5 to 7 years, there's been a huge increase in the number of families and kids. Was that a factor? I just don't know why. So I'm very curious as to why that happened.
Well, children are not present themselves because I focused on, obviously people who were active in different groups.
Right.
But what is present in the book, it is what people did because they had children. And some of their fears came from the fact that they had children and what does it mean in terms of sending them to schools. And a lot of, the people who had kids actually moved out of the South End, and I mentioned that. A lot of people, came to moved to the South End, stay a few years, and moved out of the South End. So, in like the people who are, I'm sure you know this book. Well, anyway, and I didn't. It's true that I didn't do a lot about school association, although I have a few pages in the last chapter of the book, if I remember well. And I didn't do an extensive research on this issue, but what I saw was something very similar actually to what I had found in other groups. It's the way some people get active in parents' association, send their kids in local schools, in some local schools, not all of them, one of them in particular, because they want their kids to be in a diverse environment. At the same time, they want to control this environment. I mean, it's the same dynamic. It's the same. They want their kids to live with diversity, enjoy diversity, be with black kids, and know what diversity is. That's true, and they're very, very I don't know honest about that. At the same time, they want to control this diversity. So that just confirmed one of my arguments.
I just like to address that point. In my book, I talk about, especially in the busing chapter, I talk about the irony of the South End children, and I use Herb and Ann's kids as examples. Kids being bussed out of the South End to other neighborhoods to try to desegregate other neighborhoods. Kids who are assumed to be minorities because they live in the South End. White kids being sent to white neighborhoods in Allston, Brighton, and Charlestown. When you had a diverse neighborhood right there with kids going to the schools together, it's one of the tragedies of busing, I think. And I think it's kind of a hole in the city and a hole in the South End. And in some ways, it's one of the causes probably that people could write a book about the South End and not talk too much about children. You could write a book about almost any Boston neighborhood because of the screwy system we have. So I think, to me, the neighborhood school is the best organizing tool and the best community building tool we have. And we haven't had that in Boston for a long time.
Well, of course, I talk about the role of developers and real estate agents. I talk about real estate agents in my chapter about the Historical Society and the real estate agents who joined the Historical Society. And I talk about, of course, economic issues, but as I was saying earlier, economic issues that often were disguised under this cultural banner. And also what I explain in the book, what I describe in the book, is the role of another developer who arrived in the South End in the 90s and after 2000, and who played a major role in the renovation of Washington streets. The guy I call Dante in the book. You might recognize him. And how, unlike the Historical Society, he used another label, the artistic label. So there were a lot of course, economic interest, and he made a lot of money, and other people made a lot of money. But what I'm trying to understand is how it worked. How do you make money out of land, out of vacant lots that that have no value? How do you make values? I mean, it's like a huge question. How do you make values? And you do that, and some people did, by creating a new image of the neighborhood. by creating a new representation of the neighborhood. And the role of the artistic image played a huge role, not only in the South End, actually, in other neighborhoods in the United States and even in other countries. So, but gentrification, obviously it's about money. I mean, everybody knows that. But how do you make money? It's not like, you arrive in a neighborhood, you buy, you buy some land and you just build, you have to have people go there and buy the property and buy, you have to have people who want to move to these neighborhoods. And how do you create that? And you have to transfer a neighborhood that is considered as a skid row, a ghetto, into something else. And how do you change representations? That's a huge work.
We've heard a couple times about power relations and some people having more power in the South End and mitigations of capitalism. So what I wonder is, how much of the problem is just outright capitalism?
All of it.
How tied is gentrification to just, it's just the friendly face or the pretty face of capitalism? And are there other ways to solve it other than getting rid of capitalism?
Whew. Why don't you ask a hard question?
Are we tinkering over this and that, and tinkering with this, tinkering with that, and the whole rickety thing will come down anyway?
Do you want?
Well, I don't think I have an answer to the question, but I think it's a question worth asking. And I'm not sure that, well, you probably know more about Boston urban policies than I do, but I'm not sure that capitalist forces are so much controlled right now in Boston, or
I would say not as much as they were at one point. I'll just say a little bit more about what I said. We do have some mechanisms. Yes, it is papering over. For those who don't buy capitalism, it is papering over. For those who say, well, it's the best system since all the others are worst, that's what we're stuck with, and we have to make the best of it. And what I've been trying to point out is that we do have some of those mechanisms in Boston, and then it's all incumbent on all of us to push to get more of them, and to squeeze and turn the crank as much as we can to make the system that we find ourselves in work better for all people and all incomes.
Well,
I think we have to take this gentleman's question.
And I'm not sure about that.
Oh.
And I think if we go back to the history of capitalism, there was some period in history where capitalism was more controlled. It's when the welfare state emerged. And Thomas Piketty, in his book Capital in the 21st Century, has a very, very compelling argument about that. He said that when you have a very strong tax system, socioeconomic inequalities, decrease. And we are far from that. We're very, very, very far from that. So it's not about, we have to deal with capitalism and, there's been some time in history when the logics of capitalism and the logics of socioeconomic redistribution have, so we have to remember that, and going back to the South End and to the question of diversity. I think what we should, question about diversity, and not diversity in itself, but diversity as a watchword, diversity as a cause. I think how the way it's defined by the people I interviewed, it's diversity is good for everybody. And it doesn't mean challenging power relations or it doesn't mean redistribute any powers among groups. And I think that's something we should, question. Is diversity good for everybody? And I think that's a very strong ideological doctrine in a way, to think of diversity this way. And to go back to your question, I think it's not only about the people I interviewed, but the history of the word itself. This question of diversity came from all the movement. You have studied against urban renewal, and with this new idea that these poor communities shouldn't be demolished, and they had something very interesting about them, and including their diversity. And then in the 80s and the 90s, this notion of diversity was redefined. The racial question was highly diluted in a multitude of categories. So diversity means, of course, the racial question, but, sexual orientation, gender, etc., which is good, of course, because more issues are, addressed. But it means, and, Daniel Sabag had a very interesting book about that, affirmative action, for instance, in university has been redefined as not only not addressing the racial question, but promoting cultural diversity as something which is good in itself. And that's pretty much the definition of diversity that I found in the South End. It's good for everybody. And I believe, maybe as a sociologist, that if people are more privileged, it's sometimes at the detriment of others. It's a difficult game. And
the discussions about diversity really made me think about when we're conceptualizing diversity, of whether diversity is treated as an end in and of itself, or if diversity is a means to an end. And then that needs to make you think about what is the end that diversity is trying to serve. And that kind of goes to power relations. So if you're talking about diversity as a tool in order to redistribute power, to rebalance the studies, then it's a means to an end, and you need to think about how it's being used to serve that. Diversity as an end in and of itself can end up rather shallow, because then it's almost diversity as an aesthetic, kind of an aesthetic aspect to it, as a surface level, or almost just kind of a let's enjoy everybody else, let's enjoy everybody else's cultures, but it doesn't go very deep.
Well, it goes back to what Jim was saying. It's a good start. Getting together and let's see what we can do together. But from that, everything has to be invented. Thank you.
It is a crime to dissent, a crime to assemble, a crime to stand up for one's life.